Our study, our daf for today is daf Daled. We have to finish up here on Gimel Amid Beis, and we're up to the word taima, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines up from the bottom of daf Gimel Amid Beis. Taima de kosav rachmana oleha. How do we derive the conclusion that if an erva falls for yibum, there is no yibum? We derive it from the parsha of Achos Isha, which is oleha. If we didn't have that derivation, Havamida, we would have said that Achos Isha, and she is now one example of all of the Arayos, Miyabma. There would be Yibum. My timer, why would there be such a Havamina? After all, for an Erva, there's an Isa Karetz. Why would we override an Isa Karetz? And the answer is Damrina, Asi Essay, Vidochi Losase. The mitzvah of Yibum overrides the lav of Erva. So the Gemara objects, okay, we do have a principle called Essay Dochalosase, but it is very limited in scope. Amar, when do we say Damrina Asi Essay Vidochi Losase Greda? That's only a classic lav that generates malchus. But lotas hashesh b'kares, that's much more chamur. Midachi, is there any source or basis for overriding a lotas hashesh b'kares? Of course, you could ask, Eshes Ach itself is an Isakaris. Okay, but that, the Torah says, is the nature of the mitzvah of Yibum. But now you add another erva that overlaps. How do I know that in the case of an erva of a losas hashesh b'kares, we can override based on an essay? An essay is not powerful enough to override a los hashesh b'kares v'su, and furthermore, it's difficult. Los haseh greda minolam didachi. Actually, logically, we would say that a los haseh is more chomer than an essay. When you violate a los haseh, it's a kum v'aseh. You're actively desecrating the Torah and violating the will of God. Masha'enkin, an essay, at least you're passive. It's shevi altas. So how do we know that an essay can override a los haseh, even in the case of a classic los haseh? And here we start on Daf Daled Amud Aleph. The Gemara says, we open up the Parashas Ki Teitze, and it says, Lo silba shatnes tzemer ufishtim yachtav. And that's in Perek Chav Beis, Pasuk Yud Aleph. Now let's fast forward to Pasuk Yud Beis, the very next Pasuk. And it says, Gedilim Tasa Lach. And the Torah says that you should wear tzitzis on a beged, if the beged has arba kanfos. Why did the Torah set a contiguity between the losas of wearing chatnes and the essay of wearing tzitzis? And that's called smichus. And we're going to assume now, which is going to be the sugya for today, dorshim smichus, that we derive conclusions from the fact that the Torah put two parshas one next to the other. And Laman Ispacha Torah parshas elu lalamed sheyasa chutei tzemer lebeged shel pishtan, that you place chutim of tzitzis that are made of tzemer of wool and attach them to a beged of pishtan. Or perhaps the reverse. You take chutim of pishtan and you attach them to a beged of tzemer. Kedelukayim missus essay shel tzitzis. So we see that essay dochalosas. Again, that doesn't teach us that an essay could override a losas hashesh b'karetz. But at least as far as your second question is concerned, we have a source in the smichus of the Isur of Shatnes and the mitzvah of tzitzis that in a losas that can be subject to being trumped by an essay. The Amar Ablazar smuchim in ator minayin. How do we know that the Torah teaches us that we should derive halachas from the fact that two parshios are written contiguous one to the other? Shenemar, because David Amel says in Tilim Kuf Yud Aleph, Smuchim la'ad li'olam asuyim be'emes v'yashar. And what does this mean? Smuchim la'ad li'olam? That the beginning of this pasuk refers to Pekudei Hashem. The Pekudei Hashem, the commands and the mandates of God are meant to bring us to emes and yosher. And they were not in vain placed one next to the other. There must be a pressing need to put X near Y in order to derive from the smichus, dinim, and halachas. Miyamar Rav Sheshes Amar Rav Lazar, Mishum Rav Elazar ben Azariah, Minayin liyavama shenaflo lifnei mukashchin shein chosmin osa. She doesn't want to marry this fellow. He's very, very ill. He's got terrible condition of what we call mukashchin. His body is full of boils and so forth and so on. And how do we know that in such a case we force the Yavam, who's the mukashchin, to be choletz and free this woman from yibum shenema lo tachsam shar b'disho v'samach leiki yesh v'achim yachtav? We don't muzzle an animal when it's plowing. And immediately afterwards, the Torah in Parshas Ki Tetzei gives us the mitzvah of yibum. And the smichos harshios is teaching me that just like we don't muzzle the mouth of a shar, we don't muzzle the mouth of a yavama when she yells and screams, I don't want to marry this guy. And we're not going to force her into yibum with a mukashchin. We're going to rather force him to give a chalitza. So we see two halachas that are derived from smichos. These are two examples of many, many examples in which we derive halachas from smichos. First of all, that the essay of tzitzis overrides the losef kelayim, and secondly, that we don't force a yavama to get married to a yavam who is a mukashchin. There is a Tana who rejects deriving smuchim, and he will not derive halachas from chamisha chumshei Torah, or I should say from arba chumshei Torah. In 4 out of 5 of the chumashim, he will not allow for deriving halachas from smichas haparshios. But nevertheless, says Rav Yosef in Mishnah Torah, in the 5th of the 5 books of Moses, that's called Sefer Dvarim, Darish, he admits and he consents that we do darshan and derive halachas from smichas haparshios. And the Gemara later on is going to explain why Sefer Mishnah Torah is different than the first 4 Sfarim, and everybody consents, it's universally accepted that we're darshaning smichos. And therefore, if we go back to the pasuk in Ki Tetzei, which adds lo silba shatnus contiguous to gedil and pasalacha, we derive kelayim b'tzitzis. Everybody, even those who generally reject the principle of smichas haparshas, would agree that from Sefer Dvarim we derive halachas from smichus parshios. And the 2 examples that we gave are both from Sefer Dvarim. One, the example of kelayim b'tzitzis. The second example, that we don't force a yavama to get married to a mukashchin. Rabbi Yehuda b'Alma Dorish. It is actually Rabbi Yehuda who is the shita that rejects smichas haparshios, but Mishnah Torah Dorish. And yet I'll prove to you that Rabbi Yehuda himself derives halachas from smichas haparshios if we're in Sefer Mishnah Torah. Number 1, the alma minol to lo Dorish. Can you prove to me from some sort of Mishnah or a Brisa that Rabbi Yehuda rejects the idea of darshin and smichus haparshios? Tisanya, we learned in the Brisa, and Azay Omer, and Azay has a drush of smichus haparshios to teach us. Then a machshefa gets skila. Nemar, it says in Sefer Shmos Perikov Beis, machshefa lo sechaya, but it doesn't tell you which of the 4 mises bezdin we will implement in the case of machshefa. V'nemar, but immediately afterwards, in the very next verse, in that same chapter of Shmos Chav Beis, it says, Kol shochev behema mos yumas. And whenever it says mos yumas, it means skila. Ismacho inyan lo. The Torah attaches machshefa to the parsha of shochev behema. Why? To teach me that ma shochev behema skila, because that's how we interpret mos yumas, is so too af machshefa beskila. And that's the Shita ben Azai, who dash in smichus even in Sefer Shmos. Omalo Rabbi Yehuda turns to Ben Azai and he says, "V'chim ifneisha smacho inyan lo is therefore notzi zel skila." You're going to take a machshefa out to kill her with skila, which is the most chamura, the most severe of all misas bezdin, based on smichas haparshios. You have no right to do so. Now, Rabbi Yehuda agrees that in the case of machshefa, we do condemn her to the death of skila, but we're not going to derive from smichas parshios. We require a much stronger drasha. Ella, but rather we're going to derive it from ovi. Don't. What does that mean? In the Parsha Masechet itself, we have something a little bit strange. The Torah tells us, amongst the various types of sorcerers, there's something called Ovidoni. And Ovidoni were actually included under the general category of Machashefim. And therefore, the Torah says, Machashefa lo sechaya, we would include Ovidoni. And yet, to our surprise, the Torah went out of its way to explicate the cases of Ovidoni. Lama yatsu Ovidoni likase v'parsha nefredes. So in addition to the Parsha Machashefa lo sechaya, which is in Sefer Shmos, we also have in Sefer Vayikra a pasuk that reads the following: Ish o isha ki yeh b'hem ovo yidoni motz yumtzu. Why did the Torah have to tell me that? Ovi yidoni are just examples of a kishuv of machshefa. And the Torah already told me in Sefer Shmos, machshefa lo sechaya. Why did the Torah feel compelled to reiterate that an ovi yidoni achayev misa? The answer is lahakish lahem. These cases of Ovidoni now become paradigmic cases, and all other machshefim are equated, so to speak, and subsumed under Ovidoni. Ovidoni teaches us that just like Ovidoni is beskila. Why? Because the Torah says, "Ba'even yirgabu osam af machashefa beskila." So it means the prat is megala on the klal. And that's how Rabbi Yehuda derives the conclusion that Machshefa is killed with skila, but we don't derive it from Tmuchin. Okay, but you told me that Rabbi Yehuda consents, and in Mishnah Torah we do dash and Smuchin. With Mishnah Torah we no longer darish. How do we prove that Rabbi Yehuda is on board for deriving halachas from Smichas HaParshios in the case of Dvarim, of Sefer Dvarim? And the answer is this: Nan. We learned in a Mishnah, no say Adam anusas aviv umefutas aviv. This is the shita of Tanna Kamma, that although the Torah says ervas eishes avicha lo segale, and the Torah prohibits a person from having a relationship with his stepmother, so to speak, the wife of his father, who's not his mother. But that's only because it's Eshes Avicha. Eshes means Ishus, meaning there's a marriage relationship between his father and this woman. However, if his father had a relationship with a woman out of wedlock, without Ishus, that's called Anusa Mafuta, then the son is allowed to have a marriage relationship with Anusas Aviv or Anusas Bino, Anusas Aviv or Mafutas Aviv. Now, what about the case of Anusas Bino or Mafutas Bino? Right, a man is not allowed to marry or have a relationship with his kala, with his daughter-in-law who's married to his son. What if his son was not married to this woman, but had a relationship out of wedlock with this woman, which is called Anutzas Pino or Mafutas Pino? And the Torah says in the parasha of Kala, Ervas Kalascha lo segale. It says Kalascha. And Kalascha means the wife of your son. Isha Mekudeshes le bincha, but not anusas pino or mafutas pino. So that's the shita of Tanna Kamma. Rabbi Yehuda oser be'anusas of mafutas of. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees in the case of a woman who had an intimacy with your father, even though it was out of wedlock. The Omer of Gidol Amarav, my time in the Rabbi Yehuda, what led Rabbi Yehuda to this conclusion that there's an Easter called Anutzas of Mafutas of? And the answer is Smichos HaParshios. How so? D'chsiv. We're now in Sefer Dvarim. And in Perek Chav Gimel it says, Lo yikach ishes eishes aviv, v'lo yigaleh knaf aviv. And the extra 4 words, v'lo yigaleh knaf aviv. What is that coming to teach us? Knaf shara aviv, lo yigaleh. A woman that had a relationship with your father is prohibited to you. And that's going to be a ribui for anusa umefuta. Yeah, but how do you know that lo yigala knaf oviv is referring to anusa and mefuta mimai diba anusa ksiv? And the answer is milave dikra, from what it says earlier in the pasuk. Earlier it says the ksiv in the parasha of Ones. If a man is ma'anis besula, in Perikov Beis meets Sefer Dvarim, it says v'nasana isha shokei b'mola avia narachamishiv kesef. She's a nara besula, and he has to pay a penalty of 50 kesef because he had a relationship with this woman, with this nara, this young girl who is 12 years old. V'samachle, and immediately afterwards it says lo yikach ish es eshes aviv, and then it says lo yigala knaf aviv. And the Smichas HaParshios teaches me that we have the Parsha of Hanutza, and we have the Parsha of Knaf Aviv, and Knaf Aviv is also another example of Hanutza. We'll see clearly, therefore, that even Rabbi Yehuda, who doesn't, in general, derive halachas from Smuchin, but that's only in Kol HaTarkula, but when it comes, and therefore in the Parsha of Makashefa, which is in Sefer Shmos, he comes up with his own drasha from Ovi Doni, and he doesn't accept the other approach of Smichus HaParshas, but nevertheless, that same Rabbi Yehuda who rejects Smichus HaParshios in the case of all Chumashim, he agrees that there is a derivation of Smichus HaParshios in Sefer Dvarim. Hence, we derive the conclusion that Adam Asur be'anusas aviv, futas aviv, from a Smichus HaParshios to the Shochev Ish I'ima Avianar. For Rabbanon, the Rabbanon who reject Rabbi Yehuda in the case of Anusas Aviv, and they say that Anusas Aviv Muteres, what are they going to do with the Smichas HaParshios? And you see, by the way, from this Kasha of the Gemara, that Smichas HaParshios is something that we must darshan. If we hold that Yesh Lidrosh Smichas HaParshios, we have no choice. We always have to give an answer to the question of why the Torah put two parshas one next to the other. Gemara says that according to Rabbanan, this is not Smichut HaParshios. And these two psukim of V'nasana Isha Shochev Ima and the pasuk Lo Yigala Knaf Aviv are actually not smuchin. They don't qualify as smuchin because they are in two different chapters in Sefer Dvarim, whereas the parsha of Nara Shenensa is in Dvarim Chav Beis, I'm sorry, is in, where is it? Trouble is he has Sham here. Yeah, Dvarim Chav Beis. The parsha of Lo Yigala Knaf Aviv is in Dvarim Chav Gimel. It's in a different chapter. And if they were next to each other, contiguous, then we would be Doresh Smuchin, and then we'd come to the conclusion that you're not allowed to have a relationship with a Nusas Aviv. But Hashtilo Samachle, there is no Smichus. Tichsiv lo yikach ishes eshes aviv bein tayim. Right, there's a pasuk in the middle, and that pasuk wedges between the parsha of Ones and the parsha of Lo Yigala Knaf Aviv. Again, Rabbi Yehuda himself would say that's not a hefsek, because when it says Lo Yikach ishes eshes aviv, it means a woman who is married to his father, and then the Torah adds Lo Yigala Knaf Aviv, even if they're not married. And that's why Rabbi Yehuda could be Torish Smuchin and derive the conclusion that a Nusas Aviv is also. But the Chachamim are of the opinion that Lo Yikach Ishes Eshes Aviv is a hefsek that separates between the parsha of Nara Shenensa and the parsha of Lo Yigala Knaf Aviv. Oh, so now we have to understand. So what do the Rabbanan do with the pasuk Lo Yigala Knaf Aviv? Kishlema, we understand that according to Rabbi Yehuda, lo yigala knaf aviv is telling me a new Isa, that even if this woman was never married to your father, but she was anusas aviv or mafutas aviv, lo yigala knaf aviv, the law applies. But according to you, Chachamim, why did the Torah say lo yigala knaf aviv? Because you hold that anusas aviv mafutas aviv is mutter. And the Gemara answers, b'shomeres yavam akosu medaber. What's the case of shomeres yavam? This is a case of Reuven and Shimon, who are brothers. Reuven has a son named Chanoch, and Reuven's brother Shimon marries Sarah. Shimon dies without children. Sarah falls to Yibum, to Reuven, and she's called a Shomeres Yavam. She's waiting for Yibum. So the wife of Shimon, Sarah, has now fallen for Yibum to Reuven. And Sarah, who's a Shomeres Yavam of Reuven, is Asura Libno. Chanoch is not allowed to have a relationship with Sarah, who's a Shomeres Yavam, and the Yavam is Chanoch's father, Reuven. And that is an expression, a manifestation of what we call Yesh Zika, that Zika is a kind of an Ishus. So this woman, Sarah, who's now a Shomeres Yavam to Reuven, that's Chanoch's father, is to some extent married to Chanoch's father, Reuven. And therefore, Reuven is enjoined from this Isur. Now, again, we're talking about a Shomeres Yavam. Shomeres Yavam comes under the Isur Lav of Losia Eish Samei Sachut Lishzar. But the Gemara answers Lav or all of which they Lav. That if Chanoch would have a relationship with Sarah, the former wife of the late Shimon, or now the Shomeres Yavam of Reuven, the father of Chanoch, then he would be in violation of two separate Lav. Gemara asks the obvious, naive, so to speak, question: Mishnah Torah, my time in the Darish. Why would Rabbi Yehuda, who rejects Smuchin in 4 out of 5 books of Moses, consent in the case of the 5th book? And the Gemara answers, offers 2 answers. And the Gemara explains these 2 answers. The first of it is Mishum de Muchach, Tiyim Kain, Lichtov, Achmana Gabi Arayos. What does that mean, Muchach? The Torah takes an Isur and it's out of place. The Torah says Lo Yigala Knaf Aviv, and it should have been written in the parsha of Achrimos. Achrimos is the parsha of Arayos, and instead it says Lo Yigala Knaf Aviv in Sefer Dvarim, not in Sefer Vayikra. And that means it's out of place. Why did the Torah take it out of place? To be Doresh Smuchit, to put it together with Nasana Isha Shokhev Ima Lavia Nara Chamishim Kosef, which is a case of Anusa, and the Torah took Lo Yigala Knaf Aviv out of the Parsha of Achrimos and placed it directly here in Parshas Ki Teitze to teach me Smichus that is an Isur Hanusas Aviv. What about the second interpretation? Why do we derive Smuchin, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, in Sefer Dvarim? The Mufne, Mishum the Mufne, which means it's extra, it's redundant. What's redundant here? Tiyim Kain, if you're telling me that Anusas Aviv is Muteres, like the Chachamim, then Lichtov Rachman Yikach Yishas Eiches Aviv. Lo Yigal Knaf Aviv Lamil. It's an extra pasuk here. Again, the Rabbanan are going to defend themselves by saying that extra pasuk is teaching me Shomeres Yavam, and to add another lot. Rabbi Yehuda never accepted that, and therefore he says it's mufti, it's redundant, it doesn't teach me anything, and therefore Darshina and Smuchin, we assume that the reason why the Torah told me something that's completely unnecessary is in order to teach me some halach of smukin, and in this case to be machadish to me that nutzas aviv is awesome. Amina le'afnuye.